In this video, we'll be factoring a polynomial with 4 terms by grouping. The steps for factoring by grouping are: Step 1, group the first 2 terms together and then the last 2 terms together. Step 2, factor out a greatest common factor from each separate binomial. And Step 3, factor out the common binomial. Now sometimes if if you group the first 2 together and the last 2 together and that doesn't work, you might want to try grouping in another way. For example, sometimes grouping the first 3 terms together and leaving the last term separate may help. But usually try this first, group the first 2 terms together and then the last 2 together. Alright, the first example that we'll be doing is factor by grouping x cubed plus 7x squared plus 2x plus 14. So if we group our first 2 terms together and our last 2, we need to factor out a greatest common factor from this first pair. We see that we have x squared as the greatest common factor. So I'll factor out x squared, and when I divide x cubed by x squared, I get x plus, and then 7x squared divided by x squared is 7 plus. And then the greatest common factor in this pair is 2, so I'll factor out a 2, and when I take 2x divided by 2, I get x, and when I get 14 divided by 2 is 7. Now if you've done it correctly and it's working properly, you should get a common binomial factor in both of the terms, and you can factor that out. So we can see that we have the quantity x plus 7 in both of these terms now. So I'll factor out x plus 7. Make sure you put parentheses around this quantity, and then open the parentheses to write what's left. When I take this term and divide by x plus 7, I have x squared, and then when I take this term divided by x plus 7, I have 2. Let's do another example. Factor by grouping 3x squared plus xy minus 12x minus 4y. Note, when the second group, which is this last 2 terms here, when the second group has a negative sign in front of the first term, so our first term in the second group is this one, and it's negative, you must factor a -1 out of both terms in the second group. So we're going to factor just like we did on the previous example, but when we go to factor this one, we need to factor a negative as well as the other factors that are common in both of those. So for our first pair, we can see that we have x common to both terms. So I'll factor an x out, and when I divide my first term by x, I get 3x plus, and then xy divided by x is y. Now in this one again, remember we have to factor out negative, and it looks like we have a 4 common to both, and no variables. Okay, so when I divide negative 12x by negative 4, I get 3x, and when I divide negative 4y by negative 4, I get plus y. Now again, we can see that we have this common binomial. Yay! So I can factor that out, remembering to put parentheses around it, and then open my parentheses and write what's left. When I take this first term divided by 3x plus y, I have x x. And then when I take this last term divided by 3x plus y, I have negative 4. Let's do one more example. I'm asked to factor by grouping again. 3xy minus 21x minus 2y plus 14. I'm going to group the first two terms and the last two terms. Factoring the first two terms, I have a common factor of 3x. When I divide 3xy by 3x, I have y. When I divide negative 21x by 3x, I have a negative 7. And then I have a minus sign here in front of my first term of the second group, so I have to factor out negative, and then I have a common factor of 2. Negative 2y divided by negative 2 is y, and 14 divided by negative 2 is negative 7. Again, I have a common binomial factor that I can pull out in front, y minus 7 in parentheses, and then open my parentheses, divided by y minus 7 is 3x, and then minus 2.